Hello, brothers and sisters, and welcome to day 128 of the Chronological Read Through the Bible. Today's reading and commentary starts in Psalm chapter 22, and we're going to go all the way through to Psalm 26. I'm going to focus on Psalm 22 today. We are all so familiar with the 23rd Psalm, but the 22nd Psalm, which really, in many ways, is the greatest of the Psalms, I would say, and has the most foreshadowing of it, of the Messiah, of any of the other Psalms that we find. It's sometimes missed and looked over. Though it's also one of the more quoted Psalms, it's missed out as far as the Psalm itself, because the portions of the Psalm are quoted in the New Covenant Scriptures. I want you to consider just how it starts out. It starts out with the words, my God, why have you forsaken me? Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani. When Christ is on the cross and God turns away from him, because it's at that moment that the sins of the world have been placed upon the Messiah, in the same way that the scapegoat, or the goat for the Day of Atonement, would have the high priest's hands placed upon his head, and the sins of the people would symbolically be transferred to the goat. At that moment, Christ became sin for us. He bore our transgressions. And because of this, God could not have fellowship with a sinner. God cannot have fellowship with someone who has unrepented, unconfessed sin. But this comes the resurrection, right? I just got to put this here at the beginning. Christ rose from the grave because he, though he could bear our sins, he knew not sin. So God made him who had no sin to become sin for us, so that in him we might become the righteous of God. So Psalm 22 is very powerful. David is foreshadowing this suffering and anguish. And the cross is pictured here, though not worded as a cross. The cross is pictured here, though at this point it was not an object which the world at that time would have been familiar with. It was originally, I believe, came from Persia, and the Romans adopted it, and then the Romans spread it throughout the rest of the known world at that time as their form of execution. But I'm not even sure that the Persians were using this at the time that David was writing these words. So David in this psalm, we're going to find, if you go through it, you will see that it speaks of trusting God, it speaks of seeking God's comfort, of God's protection, of praising God, and then your perseverance, persevering under those trials and that difficulty. And then it ends with 2 points that I really wanted to stress as well, and that is worship and then evangelism. Because it's going to speak of then serving the Lord at the very end and proclaiming it, making it known. They will come and they will declare his righteousness to a people who will be born, that he has performed it. So this is going to say you're going to go out in that time of difficulty, that time of trial. You're going to go out and you are going to proclaim Christ and his glory. And of course, when David's writing this, he's not necessarily understanding the Messiah, but he's saying that it's going to be God's glory, God's righteousness is going to be proclaimed. So in a time of great anguish, David cried out to God that he felt that he had been forsaken of God. And again, as I say, it foreshadows, it foretells the Christ suffering on the cross for us. David trusted in God during his trial, during this time of difficulty, and so did Christ. We need to learn to suffer, to be able to trust Christ or trust God through our times of suffering. It's not to say that we will never suffer, but it's to say that we know who to turn to during that time of suffering. David turned to God during his rejection at the time when man had rejected David, and so did Christ. And I want you to think of that Christ was often alone. Christ, even though we picture the multitude following him, there's a time when he preached the word strong enough that they said, well, this is too difficult, and they walked away. Of course, he was left with the 12. But even the 12 at the end scattered. The 12 at the end left him. Can you imagine the pain and anguish of that? Imagine the pain and anguish of having those who were your followers, those who you cared for, those who you had tight bonds with, being the ones who just walk away and run away in some cases. That had to be so difficult for Jesus to face. And I think David was facing the same thing. We don't know exactly when the psalm was written, whether it was during the time of whether it was the time when Saul is pursuing David to seek his life. We don't know. Maybe it's when Absalom was seeking his own father's life for overthrowing his father's rule as king and usurping and taking the throne for himself. But David felt alone. David not only felt that all of his companions had fled from him, but God had as well. And I want you to consider this. He speaks in verse 12 of these mighty bulls having surrounded him, or men with the power like bulls. And, it's really speaking of, in a sense, you think like for Christ, it is these leaders, these religious leaders that had absolute authority had surrounded him. They're mocking him. They are seeking his death. And then it speaks of the anguish of thirst, basically, his bones being out of joint, his heart is like wax, his heart melting in a sense. It says it melted within me. My strength is dried up, and my tongue cleaves to my jaw. You think of all of this as pointing to Christ on the cross. It says, for dogs have surrounded me. A band of evildoers has encompassed me. And then, this is the most important part here. They pierced my hands and my feet. I can count all my bones. They look. They stare at me. They divide my garments among them, and my clothing, and for my clothing they cast lots. All of this was what happened to Christ on that dreaded day. He's nailed to the cross. Again, as I say, a form of execution that wasn't what took place at the time that David's writing this. And the people are surrounded at him. They're looking at him. They're mocking him. They've put the sign above his head, King of the Jews. Now, I know in one sense Herod was actually mocking the religious leaders at that time and also even proclaiming Christ, but we're going to get to that a ways down the road, but we'll get to speaking more of the sign of his head. But in another sense it was to say, hey, this is who he claimed to be. Can you imagine that day being Christ on the cross and the people calling out insults? Here you are, your God. You've done everything for mankind. You've poured yourself out for the people, and now you're facing the ultimate price for those who you love, and that's that you're dying for them. And I think David, even though he's writing this almost prophetically, he's also experiencing this to a certain extent. He had given up his life to be the leader of the people of Israel. He might have very well just been happy being a shepherd the rest of his life. And now Here he is, the King of Israel. And maybe there's days he probably looked out across the shepherd field and thought, I'd rather be a shepherd. We see that when we get to the next psalm. The 23rd Psalm, probably the one psalm that's the most memorized chapter of the Bible. For the Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He makes me lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside quiet waters. He restoreth my soul. He guides me in the paths of righteousness for his name's sake. I want you to consider David's writing this about the shepherd and the sheep, but also consider the suffering servant and the chapter that comes before it. Well, brothers and sisters, I hope that you're having a good day. Until tomorrow, God bless.